The night Greyvale froze was the worst night in 10 years. The wind came first. It rolled down from the northern mountains like something angry, pushing through the pine trees and rattling every window in every cottage in the settlement. Then came the ice, not snow, not rain, but sharp, stinging ice that bit at skin and turned puddles into hard mirrors in minutes. The sky went from gray to black, and the black swallowed everything. Most people in Greyvale locked their doors and stayed inside. Lena did not. She was 9 years old and small for her age. She had thin brown hair that she kept in 2 messy braids, and brown eyes that were always watching something. A beetle on a leaf, a cloud shaped like a rabbit, a stranger walking through the market. She noticed things that other people walked past. That was just the way she was. She lived with her grandmother at the very edge of the settlement, where the last row of cottages ended and the dark forest began. Their cottage was old but warm. The walls were thick stone, the fireplace was wide, and Nana Rose always kept a pot of something hot sitting on the stove. It was a good home. Small but good. That evening, Nana Rose had told Lena to come inside before the storm hit. Lena had meant to. She truly had. But the barn door latch was broken, and if the wind pulled it open, the 2 old hens inside would freeze before morning. So Lena had pulled on her coat, a thick, patched thing that used to belong to her mother, wrapped a scarf around her neck and gone out to fix the latch herself. The cold hit her like a wall the moment she stepped outside. She gasped and tucked her chin down and moved quickly across the yard, her boots crunching over the ice that was already forming on the dirt path. The wind pushed against her like it was trying to send her back inside. She pushed back harder. She reached the barn, jammed the latch into place with a stick and a piece of wire, checked on the hens, both fine, both huddled together and unimpressed with her, and turned to run back to the cottage. That was when she heard it. It was not a loud sound. The storm was loud. The wind was loud. The cracking of branches in the forest behind the cottage was loud. But underneath all of it, underneath the howling and the cracking and the hiss of ice hitting stone, there was something else. A small sound. Weak. Thin. Like something very young and very frightened trying to call for help and not having enough strength left to do it properly. Lena stopped walking. She stood in the middle of the icy yard with the wind pulling at her braids and she listened. There it was again. Coming from the forest edge, just past the back fence where the pine trees started. A whimpering sound. 2 voices maybe. Soft and broken and desperate. Nana Rose would have said go inside. Any sensible adult would have said go inside. The storm was getting worse by the second and the forest at night was no place for a 9-year-old girl. Lena went toward the sound. She climbed over the back fence, dropped into the knee-deep frozen grass on the other side, and pushed toward the tree line. The ice stung her cheeks and her fingers were already aching inside her gloves, but she kept moving toward that sound because she could not have walked away from it any more than she could have stopped breathing. The sound was coming from beneath a large pine tree that had come down sometime during the day. It was a big tree, old and heavy, and it had fallen against a boulder and split on impact, leaving a dark hollow space underneath the broken trunk. Lena crouched down and peered into the hollow. 2 eyes looked back at her. Then 2 more. She pulled out the small light she kept clipped to her coat pocket. Nana Rose insisted she always carry it, and shone it into the hollow space. What she saw made her breath stop completely. 2 creatures were huddled together in the hollow beneath the fallen tree. They were small, roughly the size of large cats, with long tails curled around their bodies and tiny wings pressed flat against their backs. Their scales should have been bright, she thought, but right now they were pale and dull, like color draining from something that was losing warmth fast. One had the faint trace of gold markings along its spine. The other had markings that looked almost silver. They were pressed together so tightly they looked like one creature, both of them trembling so hard she could see it even from outside the hollow. They looked at her with enormous eyes. Not aggressive. Not dangerous. Just terrified and cold and exhausted. Lena had never seen anything like them in her life. She did not know what they were. She did not know where they had come from or how they had ended up under a fallen tree on the edge of a human farming settlement in the middle of an ice storm. She had no answers to any of those questions. What she knew was that they were small and they were frightened, and they were going to die if they stayed there much longer. She pulled off her coat. The cold hit her instantly, sharp and mean, cutting right through her shirt. She ignored it. She reached into the hollow slowly, moving carefully so she would not frighten them, and she spread the coat open on the frozen ground in front of them. The smaller one, the one with the silver markings, made a weak sound and pressed back. The other one, the one with gold along its spine, watched her with tired, half-closed eyes. Lena kept her movements slow. She kept her voice very quiet. "It is okay," she said softly, the way she always talked to the injured bird she found in the yard. I'm not going to hurt you. You're so cold. Let me help. She did not know if they understood her. She did not think it mattered much. She had found that frightened creatures did not really listen to words. They listened to how you moved and how you sounded and whether you felt safe. She must have felt safe enough. The one with the gold markings shifted forward first, slow and shaking, and stepped onto the coat with trembling legs. A moment later the smaller one followed, pressing immediately against the first one's side. Lena wrapped the coat around them both as carefully as she could. They were heavier than they looked. She got her arms underneath the bundle and stood up slowly, and the weight of them made her stagger for a second before she found her balance. Then she turned and ran for the cottage as fast as she could carry them. The wind hit her harder without her coat. The ice stung her arms and her neck and her face. Her boots slipped twice on the frozen yard and both times she caught herself without dropping them, holding the bundle tighter and moving faster. She hit the back door of the cottage with her shoulder, burst through it, and stumbled into the warmth of the kitchen. Nana Rose was standing at the stove and turned around at the sound of the door. She saw Lena, soaked, shivering, red-faced from the cold, and opened her mouth to say something sharp about being outside in a storm. Then she saw what Lena was carrying. The sharp thing she was going to say did not come out. Lena crossed the kitchen and knelt down on the rug in front of the wide fireplace and set the bundle down gently. She opened the coat slowly. The two hatchlings lay still, trembling, pale, their small chests rising and falling in quick, shallow breaths. The firelight caught the faint markings on their scales, gold and silver, patterns that looked almost like writing to someone who knew where to look. Nana Rose stood very still in the middle of the kitchen for a long moment. "Lena," she said quietly. "They were going to die, Nana," Lena said simply. She was already pulling the spare blanket from the basket by the fire and tucking it around them. "I could not leave them." Nana Rose looked at the markings on those tiny scales. Something moved behind her eyes, something that looked almost like recognition, and alongside it, something that looked almost like fear. But Lena was not looking at her grandmother. Lena was watching the two hatchlings, her hand resting gently on the edge of the blanket, her voice dropping to the same soft sound she used for frightened birds. "You are safe now," she told them. "I have got you." The one with the gold markings opened its eyes, just barely, just a thin sliver, and looked directly at her face. Then it closed its eyes again and let out one long, slow breath, and the terrible shaking in its body grew just a little bit quieter. Outside the storm howled on. Inside the cottage the fire burned warm and steady. The first night was the hardest. Lena did not sleep at all. She sat cross-legged on the rug in front of the fireplace with the two hatchlings tucked against her sides under the blanket and watched their small chests rise and fall. Every time the breathing of one of them went too quiet, she would lean in close and listen, and every time she heard it pick back up again she would let out a long breath of her own and settle back into place. Nana Rose brought her warm milk at midnight and told her to sleep. Lena shook her head without looking up. Nana Rose looked at her granddaughter sitting there in the firelight, small and stubborn and completely serious, and decided not to argue. She brought a second blanket instead and draped it over Lena's shoulders and went to sit in her chair nearby with her old reading lamp and one of her books. Neither of them said much. The storm outside filled the silence well enough. By the time gray morning light began pushing through the frost-covered windows, both hatchlings were still alive. Their color had come back a little. Not much, but a little. The terrible pale, washed-out look had softened slightly, and their scales had a faint shine to them now that they had not had the night before. Lena noticed immediately. She smiled the way she always smiled when something she had been worrying about started getting better, quietly to herself like she did not want to say it out loud in case she jinxed it. The question of food came up that morning. Lena had no idea what dragon hatchlings were supposed to eat. She looked at Nana Rose. Nana Rose looked at the hatchlings. After a long moment of thinking, she warmed up some of the thin vegetable broth she kept on the stove and poured a little into a shallow bowl. Lena carried it over and set it down carefully in front of them. The calm one, the slightly larger one with the gold markings along its spine, lifted its head and sniffed the bowl slowly. Then it looked at Lena. Then it looked at the bowl again. Then it lowered its head and took one small, careful sip. It did not seem to hate it. The smaller one, the one with silver markings, pushed forward immediately after that and stuck its entire nose into the bowl with absolutely no patience at all. It made a small spluttering sound, pulled back, shook its head and then went right back in. Lena laughed. It was the first real laugh she had made in almost 20 hours. That was the moment she decided on their names. The calm, careful, watchful one she called Ash. It felt right, steady and quiet and gray like cooling embers, something that had survived heat without making a fuss about it. The small, nosy, impatient one she called Pip. That also felt right immediately. Pip suited a creature that stuck its whole face into a bowl of broth without any hesitation and then acted surprised about it. Ash and Pip. It felt like the right names the moment she said them out loud, and neither hatchling seemed to object. The second day was better than the first. I spent most of it watching. That was what Ash did, watched everything with those large calm eyes, turning its head slowly from Lena to Nana Rose to the windows to the fire and back again. It was not scared exactly. It was more like it was learning everything carefully before it decided what it thought. When Lena sat near it, Ash would rest its chin on her knee and watch the room from that position, completely still, like a small and very serious guard. Pip was the opposite of still. By midday of the second day, Pip had investigated every corner of the main room that it could reach. It had sniffed the legs of all the furniture. It had poked its nose behind the wood basket and sneezed 3 times from the dust. It had tried to climb the side of Nana Rose's reading chair, failed, tried again, and eventually succeeded, sitting on the armrest looking extremely proud of itself until Nana Rose noticed and made a low sound of disapproval. Pip looked at Nana Rose. Nana Rose looked at Pip. Pip stayed on the armrest. Nana Rose quietly went back to her book. Lena fed them broth 3 times that day, adding a little soft-cooked grain to it by the second bowl, which both of them accepted without complaint. In the evening she heated the broth a little warmer than before and Pip made a pleased sound into the bowl that was so ridiculous it made Lena laugh again. Ash watched Pip make that sound and looked, somehow, quietly embarrassed. That night Lena sang to them. She did not think about it too hard. She just did it the same way she had always done it, the same way she used to hum to the injured sparrow she had kept in a shoebox for 2 weeks the previous spring, the same way she murmured nonsense words to the barn cats when they were restless. She sat with her back against the warm stones of the fireplace and both hatchlings pressed against her and she sang a soft, slow song that Nana Rose had taught her when she was very small. Ash went still immediately. Completely still, the way it went when it was paying close attention to something new. Pip made a small sound, not distress, not excitement, just a soft, low sound somewhere in its chest, and pressed its head harder against Lena's ribs. Lena sang until they were both asleep. Then she looked up and found Nana Rose watching from across the room with an expression she could not quite read. It was while Lena slept that night that Nana Rose went to the shelf. She moved quietly so as not to wake anyone. She took down a box from the highest shelf, old and battered, the kind of box that had been moved from planet to planet through several decades of colony life and had the dents and scratches to prove it. She opened it and sorted through the things inside with careful hands. Old papers. Old maps. A small device that no longer worked. And at the bottom, a book, thick and heavy, with a cover that had faded from dark blue to something closer to gray. She took it to the table and opened it under the lamp. It was a colonial record book. The kind that settlement founders kept in the early years, when everything was being written down and catalogued for the first time. This particular book had belonged to Greyvale's first settlement coordinator, 3 generations back. A thorough and careful woman who had recorded not just planting schedules and building plans but also every unusual thing that passed through or near the settlement. Strange signals. Unusual atmospheric events. And once, about 60 years ago, a brief but detailed account of a Dracovan vessel passing through the system. The coordinator had included everything she could find: descriptions, cultural notes, and 3 small hand-drawn sketches of Dracovan markings, copied carefully from an old diplomatic document she had managed to get a look at. Nana Rose turned to those pages. She held the lamp closer. She looked at the sketches. Then she turned and looked at the 2 sleeping hatchlings by the fire. Then she looked at the sketches again. The gold patterning along the spine. The specific shape of the markings near the base of the neck. The silver variant, slightly rarer, noted in the text as appearing only in. Nana Rose stopped reading. She sat very still for a moment. Then she turned back to the beginning of that section and read it again, slowly and carefully, making sure she had not misunderstood. She had not misunderstood. Her hands, when she finally closed the book, were not steady. She set the book down on the table and sat in the lamplight and thought for a long time. She thought about what the book said. She thought about the warmer broth on the stove. She thought about Lena sleeping on the rug with 2 hatchlings tucked against her like they had known her their whole lives. She thought about what this meant. She looked at the window. The storm was still going. No communications in or out until it broke. No way to send a message. No way to ask for guidance. Just the cottage and the fire and the 2 children sleeping peacefully on the rug. 1 human, 2 not. Nana Rose stood up. She put the book back in the box and put the box back on the shelf. She stood there for a moment with her hand resting on the shelf edge and her eyes on the middle distance. Then she went and added another log to the fire, tucked the blanket more firmly around Lena, and went to make herself a strong cup of tea. She did not tell Lena in the morning. She told herself it was because there was nothing to be done until the storm cleared and there was no point in frightening a 9-year-old girl over something that could not be changed. That was true. But the reason she did not examine too closely, was that she had watched Lena sing those hatchlings to sleep. And she did not know how to walk into that and make it complicated. Not yet. The storm broke on the morning of the 4th day. It did not end gently. It stopped the way it had started, all at once like someone turning off a machine. 1 hour the wind was howling and ice was hitting the windows and the whole world outside was white and angry. The next hour it was quiet. The clouds pulled apart slowly and pale winter sunlight came through in thin strips, lighting up a landscape that looked like it had been dipped in glass. Every tree branch was coated in ice. Every rooftop sparkled. The whole settlement of Greyvale looked frozen in place, like a picture someone had painted and then varnished over. Lena stood at the window with Pip sitting on her left shoulder and Ash pressed against her right leg and looked out at the glittering world. "Pretty," she said quietly. Pip made a soft sound near her ear that seemed to agree. Ash just looked at it seriously, the way Ash looked at everything. They had changed a great deal in 4 days. When Lena had carried them in from the forest they had been limp and pale and barely present, like small flames about to go out. Now Ash held its head up straight and its gold markings had deepened into something rich and clear, like veins of actual metal pressed under glass. Pip's silver markings had done the same, bright and sharp, catching the firelight whenever it moved, which was constantly because Pip did not really understand the concept of staying still. They were eating properly now too. Nana Rose had added soft-cooked meat to their broth 2 days ago, small pieces, very tender, and both hatchlings had accepted this immediately and with great enthusiasm, particularly Pip, who had eaten so fast on the first occasion that it had hiccuped 3 times afterward and looked startled by itself each time. Lena had found this so funny she had nearly fallen off the rug. Even Nana Rose had smiled. Just briefly. Just a small one. But she had smiled. Things felt easy inside the cottage. That was the honest truth of it. It felt easy and warm and almost ordinary, in the way that good and comfortable things start to feel ordinary when you settle into them. Lena had a routine now. Morning broth. Midday feeding. Evening song. Lots of time in between sitting by the fire with Ash resting its chin on her knee and Pip investigating things it had already investigated 6 times before but apparently found interesting again anyway. Nana Rose watched all of it and said very little. The communications panel on the wall crackled to life that afternoon. It had been dead for 4 days, knocked out by the storm along with most of the settlement's outgoing signals. When it crackled Lena looked at it with mild curiosity. When it crackled a second time and then beeped 3 times in a row, the standard colonial emergency sequence, Nana Rose crossed the room in 4 steps and answered it. The voice on the other end was clipped and official and spoke too fast. Nana Rose listened. She asked 2 short questions. She listened again. Then she said she understood and switched it off. She stood with her back to Lena for just a moment before she turned around. "The settlement office is sending someone," she said. "They are checking on all the households at the forest edge. Storm damage assessment." Lena nodded and went back to scratching behind Ash's ears, which Ash tolerated with great dignity. Nana Rose looked at the hatchlings. Then she looked at the door. Then she went to the kitchen and stood there doing nothing for a while, which was something Nana Rose never did. The knock came the next morning. It was a firm knock. Official. The kind of knock that expected to be answered quickly. Lena was on the rug with Ash and Pip when it came. Nana Rose went to the door. She opened it and there was a colonial officer standing on the front step in a gray uniform with the Greyvale settlement badge on the shoulder. He was a broad man with a plain face and short dark hair going gray at the sides. His name tag said Colin. He had a handheld device in one hand and the look of someone who had already knocked on 14 doors that morning and expected this one to take about 3 minutes. "Morning," he said. "Storm assessment. Just need to confirm the household is intact and check for any structural." He stopped. He had looked past Nana Rose into the main room. His eyes had found Ash, who was sitting upright by the fireplace looking back at him with calm gold eyes. Then his eyes moved to Pip, who was on the back of the armchair again, tail curled around the armrest, also looking at him. The official expression on Colin's face did not exactly fall apart. It sort of crumbled slowly, piece by piece, the way a wall crumbles when the thing holding it together stops working. His hand with the device dropped to his side. "Those are," he started. "Come in," Nana Rose said, stepping back. He came in slowly. He stood in the middle of the room and looked at the 2 hatchlings and the color in his face went through 3 different changes in about 10 seconds. He went from his normal color to something paler, then to something that had a slight gray quality to it, then to something that was not quite white but was working toward it. Lena watched him from the rug. "Are they yours?" Colin asked. His voice was different now. Quieter. Like he was hoping the answer would make this simpler. "I found them," Lena said. "In the storm. Under the fallen tree at the forest edge. They were freezing." Colin looked at her. He looked at the hatchlings. He looked at Nana Rose. Nana Rose said nothing. Colin switched his handheld device on. He held it up and let it scan the room, though his hand was not entirely steady. The device made a quiet sound and he looked at the reading and the last bit of color left his face entirely. He switched it off. He put it in his pocket. He seemed to be choosing his next words with a great deal of care. "I need to make a call," he said to Nana Rose. "I know," she said. He stepped outside. Through the closed door Lena could hear the low murmur of his voice, not the words, just the sound of it, fast and tight and with the particular quality of someone trying to stay calm while saying something that was not calm at all. It went on for several minutes. At one point his voice went up slightly and then came back down. Then it went quiet. He came back inside. He stood in the doorway and looked at the room and seemed to be doing something very difficult in his mind, some kind of hard internal negotiation between the thing he had been told to do and the thing that was in front of him. "There are Dracovan vessels in this system," he said finally. "They have been here for 4 days. We believe they are searching for something." He paused. "The colony authority has determined that the correct diplomatic action is to hand the hatchlings over immediately and formally, as a gesture of cooperation." The room was very quiet. Pip's tail moved slowly on the armrest. Ash did not move at all. Colin looked at Lena. "I'm sorry. I know you helped them. But this is much larger than—" Lena stood up. She was 9 years old and small for her age. The top of her head came to somewhere around Colin's chest. She had broth on her sleeve from the morning feeding and her braids were coming loose on one side and she was wearing socks with a small hole in the left toe. She stepped in front of Ash and Pip and she looked at Colin with an expression that was not angry. It was not dramatic. It was very simply and completely serious, the way a person looks when they have already decided something and the deciding is done. "They were cold," she said. Her voice was quiet and even. "They were scared and they were going to die. I brought them in and I kept them warm and I have looked after them for 4 days." She did not raise her voice. She did not need to. "You are not taking them." Colin looked at her. Lena looked back. Behind her, Ash stood up slowly and moved to stand exactly beside her left leg. Pip dropped silently from the armchair and pressed against her right side. The three of them stood there together, one small human girl and 2 dragon hatchlings, and looked at the colonial officer with the same steady, unhurried certainty. Colin was a grown man with a uniform and an official device and the full authority of the Greyvale colonial government behind him. He took one step back. He did not plan to. His feet just did it. He stood there for a moment, then reached up and pressed the communicator at his collar. "This is Colin," he said, his voice very carefully neutral. "I am at the location. He paused. There is a complication. Nobody in Greyvale slept that night. Word had moved through the settlement the way bad news always moves, fast and quiet and unstoppable, passing from one household to the next in whispered conversations and hurried knocks on doors. By evening almost everyone knew. Dracovan vessels in the system. Ships the size of small mountains sitting in orbit above their little farming world. Colonial officials running back and forth between the communication center and the settlement office with tight faces and fast steps. And at the center of all of it, somehow, impossibly, a 9-year-old girl in a patched coat and a cottage at the edge of the forest. The colonial officials had not tried to take Ash and Pip again after Colin's call. Not yet. 3 more officers had come to the cottage by evening, each one more senior than the last, each one standing in the doorway with a careful expression and careful words about diplomacy and cooperation and the importance of not creating an incident. Each one had looked at Lena. Each one had looked at the 2 hatchlings standing beside her. Each one had left without the hatchlings. Nobody could entirely explain why. It was not that Lena argued with them. She did not. She did not shout or cry or make demands. She just stood in front of Ash and Pip and looked at whoever had come with that same quiet, finished certainty, the expression of someone who had already decided and was not going to undecide, and something about it made the words of the officials come out smaller than they had gone in. Nana Rose made tea for all of them. She was very calm. Lena thought it was the calmness of someone who had already done their worrying privately and come out the other side of it. That night Nana Rose sat on the edge of Lena's bed after the hatchlings were asleep by the fire and she told Lena the truth. All of it. The old colonial record book. The markings. What the markings meant. Who the Dracovan were, their empire, their history, their pride, how ancient they were and how much power they held across this part of the galaxy. Lena listened to all of it without interrupting. When Nana Rose finished there was a short silence. Are they going to try to take Ash and Pip? Lena asked. Someone will come for them, Nana Rose said carefully. Yes. Lena was quiet for another moment. Okay, she said. Nana Rose looked at her. Okay. I am not going to stop whoever comes, Lena said. I just want to talk to them first. She looked toward the main room where the two hatchlings were sleeping by the fire. I want to make sure they know that Ash and Pip were not hurt. That they were looked after. She paused. Whoever is looking for them is probably scared. I would want to know if it was someone I loved. Nana Rose looked at her granddaughter for a long moment. Then she leaned over and kissed the top of her head and said goodnight and went to her room, and Lena heard her sit down heavily in the chair by her window and stay there for a long time in the dark. The shadow came at dawn. Lena felt it before she saw it. She had been half asleep on the rug with Ash and Pip when the quality of the light through the windows changed. Not darker exactly, more like the light was being displaced, moved aside by something large passing between the cottage and the sky. She opened her eyes. Ash was already standing. Still and straight, nose lifted, gold eyes fixed on the ceiling as if it could see through it. Pip was completely silent, which almost never happened. Lena got up and went to the window. The sky over Greyvale was full of ships. Not full the way a busy port was full the way a horizon is full when a storm is coming and there is nothing else to look at. They were enormous, dark and smooth and so large that the mind struggled to understand the scale of them. 3 of them in a wide formation, moving slowly and deliberately like they had all the time in the world and knew it. And behind those 3, larger than all of them combined, a vessel that did not look like a military ship. It looked like something older than that. Something that had been built not just for war or travel but to make absolutely clear, to anyone who saw it, exactly what it represented. The settlement's emergency signal was going off somewhere in the distance. People were coming out of their houses and looking up. The ships descended slowly. The 3 military vessels stopped and held position above the tree line. The large vessel came lower, much lower, and moved toward the open field behind the cottage, the wide flat field where Lena sometimes flew the small paper gliders she made on slow afternoons. It landed with a sound that Lena felt in her chest more than heard. A deep, heavy sound like the world settling. Then the door of the cottage burst open and 4 colonial officials came in all at once, talking over each other, and Colin was behind them looking like he had not slept and was not expecting to sleep anytime soon. They were all talking about protocol and positioning and diplomatic procedure and the correct way to present the hatchlings and who should stand where. Lena was not listening. She was watching Ash. Ash had turned toward the back of the cottage, toward the field, and was standing very still with an expression that Lena had not seen on it before. Not fear. Not excitement exactly. Something quieter than either of those. Something that looked like recognition. Pip made a small sound and pressed against Lena's leg. Lena put her hand gently on Pip's head for a moment. Then she picked up her coat from the hook by the door, the old patched coat, the one she had wrapped them in on the first night, and she put it on. She walked to the back door. Wait, one of the officials said sharply. You cannot go out there. We have not established the correct approach sequence. There are protocols. I am going to go talk to them, Lena said simply. She opened the back door and walked out into the cold morning air. The field behind the cottage looked different with the ship in it. The ship was dark and enormous and covered the far end of the field entirely, and its surface caught the early light and scattered it in ways that made the frost on the grass look like it was glowing. Soldiers stood in a long line at the base of the ship, tall, scaled, armed, completely still. Colonial officers had gathered at the field's edge and every single one of them had gone to their knees the moment the ship's main ramp had opened. Lena walked across the frost-covered grass alone. She heard Colin behind her make a desperate sound and then stop. She heard someone mutter something urgent and then go quiet. She kept walking. The ramp of the ship was wide and dark and at the top of it, moving with the slow deliberate certainty of something that had never once needed to hurry, came Emperor Dreven. He was the largest living creature Lena had ever seen. His scales were deep black threaded through with gold that caught and held the light the way embers hold it, not reflecting it but keeping it, making it something warmer and older. His wings were folded against his back but even folded they were enormous, their span visible above his shoulders like the edges of a second sky. His eyes were amber and very old, not old the way tired things were old but old the way mountains were old, old in a way that had simply seen too much to be surprised by anything easily. He came down the ramp and into the field and stopped. Every person present was on their knees except Lena. Lena stopped about 10 steps away from him and looked up at him. The top of her head reached somewhere below his knee. She had broth on her sleeve again, and one of her braids was loose, and her coat had a patch on the left elbow that was a slightly different color than the rest of it. She looked up at the Emperor of the Dracovan Empire, and she did not flinch. For a long moment he looked down at her and said nothing. The silence in the field was absolute. Then he spoke. His voice was deep in a way that had nothing to do with volume. It did not need to be loud to fill every corner of the space around them completely. "Where are my children?" "Inside," Lena said. "Sleeping. They had a good night." Another silence. Then, quieter than before, in a voice that had lost just a fraction of its formality, just a fraction but enough to notice, "Did they suffer?" Lena shook her head. "I made sure they didn't." The field was so quiet that the frost on the grass seemed loud. Emperor Dreven looked down at this small human girl standing alone in the cold morning with her patched coat and her loose braid and her completely steady eyes. And then, slowly, with the full gravity and weight of every year of his ancient life, he lowered his great head. Down and down, until it was level with her, until those vast amber eyes were looking directly into hers from just a few steps away. Behind Lena, she heard one of the Dracovan soldiers make a sharp intake of breath. She heard Colin whisper something that sounded like it might have been a prayer. She stayed still and looked back at the Emperor and did not look away. The back door of the cottage opened. Nobody had called them. Nobody had gone inside to get them. The door simply opened on its own, pushed from the inside by a small, determined nose, and Pip came out first, moving fast across the frost-covered grass with its silver markings catching the morning light like scattered coins. Ash came right behind, steady and quiet as always, gold markings deep and clear against its dark scales. They had heard him. That was the only explanation. Through the walls of the cottage, through the cold morning air, across the field, they had heard or felt or sensed something that no one else could, and they had come. The Dracovan soldiers along the base of the ship went completely rigid. Several of them made small sharp movements that were not quite steps forward. The instinct to move checked immediately by discipline, but visible anyway. The colonial officials at the field's edge made various sounds of alarm and uncertainty. Lena stepped to the side so she was not between the hatchlings and their father. Pip hit a patch of frost halfway across the field and skidded, recovered without slowing down, and kept going. Ash did not skid. Ash never skidded. Ash moved with the careful, deliberate precision of a creature that had decided it was not going to embarrass itself, not today, not in front of all these people. They reached Emperor Dreven, and the sounds they made were unlike anything Lena had heard from them in 5 days. Not the soft chirps and murmurs she knew. Something deeper and more urgent and full of a kind of relief that did not need any translation at all. Pip pressed its face against the Emperor's leg and made a continuous low sound, and Ash leaned its full small weight against the same leg and went still in the way it only went still when it finally felt safe. Dreven lowered his head slowly and touched each of them in turn, a gentle press of his nose to the top of each small head, a gesture so careful and private that it felt almost wrong to watch. Lena looked away for a moment. It felt like the right thing to do. Around the field the Dracovan soldiers had straightened. Several of them had expressions that were harder to read now. Something had shifted in the formality of the moment, cracked it open slightly to let something more human through, or whatever the Dracovan word for human was. Then Pip pulled back. It turned around. It looked at Lena. Lena looked back at it. Pip crossed the frost-covered grass and walked straight to Lena and pressed its small head against her chest and made the soft low sound, the one Nana Rose had heard on the second night, the one she had gone very still about and not explained until much later. Lena put her arms around Pip automatically. That was just what you did when Pip pressed against you. You held on. A few seconds passed. Then Ash turned away from its father. It walked across to Lena and pressed against her left side and leaned its weight into her the way it always did, the way that meant I am here and I am staying and this is where I have decided to be. The field went very quiet. Not the quiet of before, which had been tense and watchful. This was a different kind of quiet. Confused mostly. Uncertain. The colonial officials looked at each other. The soldiers looked at their emperor. Everyone was trying to work out what they were seeing and what it meant. Everyone except one person. A figure stepped forward from the group near the ship, tall and composed, with pale gray-green scales and dark careful eyes and the kind of stillness that came from spending a very long time in rooms where the wrong word could change everything. She wore a sash across her chest that had markings on it Lena did not recognize but which clearly meant something important, because every other Dracovan present treated the space around her with a certain respect. She stopped a few steps away and looked at the scene in front of her, Lena standing in the frost with one arm around Pip and Ash pressed against her side, and her expression was not confused. It was something closer to recognition, and underneath that, something that might have been awe, very carefully controlled. She turned to Emperor Driven and spoke in Dracovan. Her voice was low and even. She spoke for about a minute without stopping. Driven listened. He did not move. His amber eyes stayed on Lena and the hatchlings the entire time the advisor spoke. When she finished, he was silent for a long moment. Then he spoke one word in Dracovan, and she turned and crossed to the colonial officials and spoke to them in clear, precise galactic standard. "I am Consul Aldra," she said, "senior advisor to the Imperial Throne. I will explain what you have just witnessed because it is important that you understand it correctly." The officials listened. Colin was in the front. He had the expression of a man who had stopped expecting the morning to make sense and was now just trying to keep up. "In Dracovan culture," Aldra said, "a hatchling forms early bonds through proximity and care. This is normal and expected. When a hatchling is separated from its family and cared for by another, a temporary dependency forms. This is also normal." She paused. "However, when a hatchling, upon being reunited with its birth family, chooses to return to its caregiver, in full awareness of its parent's presence, this is not a temporary dependency. This is something different." She let that sit for a moment. "It is called a Vethra bond," she continued. "The word does not translate precisely. The closest meaning in your language would be, chosen family. Permanent and willing. Not formed by birth or obligation but by choice, made at a moment of full freedom." Her voice was even and careful and absolutely serious. "Under Imperial law, a Vethra bond is sacred. It cannot be dissolved. It cannot be transferred. It cannot be revoked by any authority, including the Emperor himself." Another pause. "Both hatchlings have formed this bond simultaneously, which has not, in any record I have access to, ever happened before." The colonial officials were completely silent. Colin's mouth had opened slightly. He did not appear to be aware of it. Aldra turned back to face Driven. Something passed between them, not words, just a long look that carried a great deal of weight. Then Driven turned to Lena. He was so large and she was so small, and the space between them was just a few steps of frost-covered grass. He looked down at her with those ancient amber eyes, and she looked up at him with her steady brown ones, and neither of them looked away. "You kept them warm?" he said. It was not a question. But Lena answered it anyway. "Yes," she said. "You stayed with them through the nights." "Yes." "When you found them," he said slowly, "you did not know what they were." "No," Lena said. "But you helped them anyway." Lena looked at him with a small expression of honest confusion, like this was the part she understood least of all. "Of course," she said simply. "They needed help." Driven was quiet for a long moment. Then he straightened to his full height. When he did it, the whole field seemed to feel it, a shift in the air, a change in weight. The soldiers along the ship's base straightened too, automatically. Aldra stepped back one pace and stood very still. When Driven spoke next, his voice had changed. It had not gotten louder. It had gotten more formal, layered and resonant in a way that felt less like a person speaking and more like something being written permanently into the record of the world. "By the right of the Vethra bond, witnessed and confirmed," he said, "and by my authority as Emperor of the Dracovan throne, I declare the human child Lena to be a ward of the Imperial throne. This declaration carries the full protection, honor and standing of the Empire. No power within or outside Imperial reach may act against her without consequence." He paused. "The elder human, her grandmother, is granted full Imperial courtesy and protection by extension. This is permanent and unconditional." He stopped speaking. The words seemed to stay in the air for a moment after he finished. Aldra was writing something on a small device. 3 of the soldiers had their heads bowed. Colin had sat down on a frost-covered rock at the edge of the field without appearing to notice he had done it. Lena looked up at the Emperor. "Can they still visit me?" she asked. It was a simple question, asked in a simple voice, with no awareness at all of the magnitude of everything that had just happened around it. Something moved through Driven's expression. It started somewhere around his eyes and worked its way outward slowly. It was not a human smile. His face was not built for that. But every person in that field, human and Dracovan alike, understood exactly what it was. "Yes," he said. "They can visit." Pip made a happy sound against Lena's chest. Ash leaned slightly harder into her side. Lena nodded like this was the answer she had needed, and now everything else could be sorted out in its own time. Behind her she heard Nana Rose, who had come out of the cottage at some point and was standing at the field's edge with her old cardigan pulled around her shoulders, let out a long and very quiet breath. 1 year is not a very long time in the life of an empire. For the Dracovan, who measured history in centuries and kept records going back further than most human civilizations had existed, 1 year was barely a breath. A footnote. A single line in a very long book. But 1 year can change a great deal in a small farming settlement on a cold colony world at the edge of inhabited space. Greyvale was different now. Not loudly different. Not in the way that places changed when something dramatic happened to them, not rebuilt or renamed or filled with strangers. It was still the same rows of stone cottages. Still the same frost on the grass in the mornings, the same pine forest at the edge of the settlement, the same market on the main road every seventh day where people sold vegetables and tools and argued cheerfully about prices. But there was a Dracovan diplomatic post at the north end of the settlement now. A small building, dark and well-made, with 2 Imperial soldiers stationed outside it at all times. Quiet and still and professional, nodding politely to the settlers who walked past and accepting, after the first few months, the occasional cup of hot tea from old Mrs. Fenwick next door, who had decided that standing outside in the cold all day was no way to live and that her tea was good enough for anyone regardless of species. The soldiers had eventually started accepting the tea. This had pleased Mrs. Fenwick enormously. The diplomatic post was not there for trade negotiations or political reasons. It was not there because Greyvale had anything strategically important about it. It was there because a ward of the imperial throne lived in the cottage at the edge of the forest, and where a ward of the throne lived, the empire maintained a presence. That was simply how it worked. The rest of inhabited space had found out about Lena within about 2 weeks of the emperor's visit. It had not been announced. Nobody had put out an official statement. But these things moved on their own, passed between colony worlds and trading posts and diplomatic channels until the whole shape of it was known even in places that had never heard of Greyvale before. A human girl. 2 hatchlings in an ice storm. A Vethra bond. The emperor's bow in a frosted field. The reactions had been varied. Some people thought it was a remarkable story. Some officials in the colonial government were still quietly furious about the whole thing, though they were careful about who they said that to. Several academic institutions had sent letters requesting interviews with Lena, which Nana Rose had declined politely on her behalf. A journalist from a large off-world publication had shown up at the settlement once and been turned away at the diplomatic post before getting anywhere near the cottage, which Lena had not found out about until later and which had made her feel slightly guilty even though she had not done anything. The most significant reactions had come from the Dracovan side. Within the Empire the story had moved differently. More carefully. More deeply. The Dracovan were not a species that changed their minds quickly or loudly. Their opinions shifted the way glaciers moved, slowly, with enormous weight, and in ways that permanently reshaped the landscape when they finally came to rest somewhere new. But they shifted. Consul Aldra had written a formal document that was distributed through imperial channels. Not a political document, not a legal one, but something closer to what humans might call a public letter. It described what she had witnessed in the field outside the cottage. It described it plainly, without embellishment, the way Aldra did everything. And in the final section she wrote about what it meant, not legally, not diplomatically, but in terms of what it said about the species that had produced a 9-year-old girl who had walked into a frozen storm and carried 2 strangers home without knowing or needing to know who they were. It was read widely. It was discussed for months. And in the slow, weighty way that Dracovan opinions moved, something began to change in how they talked about humans. Not all of them. Not overnight. But enough, and in enough important places, that people who watched these things carefully noticed it and wrote it down. Lena knew almost none of this. She knew that Greyvale felt different. She knew that the diplomatic soldiers nodded to her when she walked past and that she had started nodding back without thinking about it. She knew that some of the other children in the settlement looked at her differently now, though she was not entirely sure what to do about that, so mostly she just continued being herself and hoped it would sort itself out. She knew that twice a year a Dracovan vessel landed in the field behind the cottage and Ash and Pip came out of it and everything went back to being simple and good. The visits were the best parts of the year. Ash had grown. Not enormously, hatchlings grew slowly in the first few years, Lena had learned, but noticeably. Its gold markings had deepened and spread and it moved with a little more weight and certainty than before. It still watched everything with those calm, careful eyes. It still put its chin on Lena's knee when it was sitting near her, even though the chin was bigger now and considerably heavier. Pip had also grown and had not become any calmer about it. Pip arrived at each visit like it had been waiting the entire 6 months in a state of barely contained impatience and was only now able to release it. It made noise. It investigated everything in the cottage again from the beginning as if the furniture might have changed. It had, on the last visit, attempted to sit on top of the wood basket in the way it used to when it was small enough to fit there, discovered it was no longer small enough to fit there, and looked so genuinely puzzled by this that Lena had laughed until her sides hurt. The most remarkable thing Pip had done was the singing. On the second visit, 6 months after the first, Lena had been sitting by the fire in the evening and humming the soft slow song, the same one she had always sung, when Pip had made a sound that had stopped her mid-note. It was not quite the song. It was a low, slightly uncertain, deeply earnest attempt at the melody. The notes were not all in the right places. The rhythm was approximate at best. But it was unmistakably trying to be the song. Lena had stared at Pip for a long moment. Pip had stared back, clearly waiting to find out if it had done the right thing. Lena had started the song again from the beginning, slowly, and Pip had tried again alongside her, and it was still not right, but it was a little closer, and by the end of it they were both making the sound together in the firelight, and it was the strangest and most wonderful music that had ever been made in that cottage. Nana Rose had stood in the kitchen doorway and watched and said absolutely nothing. The quiet evening when Nana Rose said the thing she said came near the end of the year. Late autumn, the cold coming back in, the first frost of the season glittering on the glass. Lena was at the table doing the reading that Aldra had been sending her, basic Dracovan script, a few pages a week, hard-going but interesting, and Nana Rose was in her chair by the fire with her tea. For a while neither of them spoke. It was the comfortable kind of silence. Then Nana Rose said quietly, not looking up from her cup, "You did not even know who they were." Lena looked up from the page. She thought about it for a moment. About the storm and the dark in the hollow under the fallen tree. About 2 small pale frightened creatures with the cold killing them quietly and no one coming. She shrugged. "That is why I helped them," she said simply. Nana Rose looked at her over the rim of her cup. She did not say anything else. She just looked at her granddaughter with an expression that was full of something too large and too quiet to fit into words, and then she looked back at the fire. Lena went back to her Dracovan script. The frost built up on the window glass. The fire burned warm and steady. Aboard the Imperial flagship, in a private chamber that only the Emperor's most trusted advisors ever entered, there was a sealed case on a shelf. It was a plain case. Nothing marked it as significant. It sat between older and more obviously important things, and nothing about it announced itself. Inside it was a coat. Small. Patch. The elbows worn thin, one patch a slightly different color than the rest. A child's coat, clearly, too small for any adult, made for someone young and not yet grown. There was a small rust-colored stain on the left cuff from the broth on the second morning, which had never quite come out. It was the most ordinary object in the Emperor's chambers by a very long way. Emperor Dreven passed it every day. Some days he did not look at it. Some days he did. On the days he looked at it he thought about a frosted field at dawn and a small human girl standing in it alone with her loose braid and her steady eyes, with no weapon and no authority and nothing behind her except the simple and complete certainty that she had done the right thing. He thought about what it had taken to do that and how quietly she had done it, and how little she had thought it worth mentioning. And on those days the Emperor of the Dracovan Empire, who had lived long enough to have seen nearly everything, found that there was still something left in the world that could make him feel the particular kind of feeling that had no name in any language he knew. Only the coat knew. And the coat said nothing.